On the night of July 17, 1918, in the cellar of a merchant's house in the Ural Mountains, a firing squad raised their revolvers at 4 young women and discovered to their horror that the girls would not die. They were not soldiers, they were not armored, they were grand duchesses. The 4 daughters of the last emperor of Russia, raised in palaces, painted by the finest artists in Europe, the most eligible princesses on earth. And in that basement, something sewn against their bodies was turning bullets aside. What were these girls wearing that could stop a bullet at point-blank range? And how did the very thing meant to save their family become the reason their deaths took so unbearably long? This is the story of the Romanovs, the dynasty that ruled 1/6 of the earth for more than 300 years, and of 4 sisters who signed their letters with a single name they invented for themselves: Otma, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, born at the absolute summit of human privilege, and destroyed in a room 12 feet wide. A father who inherited the most absolute power on earth and could not bear to give an inch of it away. A secret illness that opened the palace doors to a peasant statistic, and a hidden fortune, stitched, quite literally, into the seams of the girls' clothing, that would betray them in the cruelest way imaginable. Watch this not as a story about royalty. Watch it as a study of what a family will sacrifice to preserve an inheritance, and what that inheritance does to the children it was meant to protect. And remember one ordinary object, a girl's corset, heavier than it should be. We will return to that basement, and to what was hidden inside it. To understand why 4 innocent girls ended up in that cellar, you have to begin not with them, but with a doctrine, and with the giant of a man who carved it into his son. His name was Alexander III, Tsar of all the Russias, and he was, by every account, a mountain. Physically immense, he could reportedly bend an iron poker with his bare hands, and politically immovable. He believed, with the certainty of stone, in one idea above all others: autocracy. The conviction that the Tsar's power came directly from God, that it must be absolute, undivided, answerable to no parliament and no people, and that it must be passed to his son completely intact, not 1 inch surrendered. Picture the household this produced. A father like a fortress, who ruled 1/6 of the planet by sheer will, and a quiet, gentle, almost shy eldest son named Nicholas, a boy who loved his family, his diaries, and the quiet of the countryside, and who was, by temperament, perhaps the least suited man in Russia to wield absolute power. Alexander knew his son was soft, so he did what fathers in these stories always do. He decided there was time. Time to harden the boy later, time to teach him the machinery of rule once he was older. The Tsar was robust, only in his 40s. The lessons could wait. That was the fatal miscalculation, and it is the seed of everything. Because Alexander III did not have time. In 1894, at just 49, the Iron Tsar sickened and died with shocking speed, leaving the throne of the most autocratic empire on earth to a 26-year-old son he had never finished preparing. Nicholas, stunned, reportedly asked in despair what would become of him, confessing he was not ready to rule, that he knew nothing of the business of governing. He had inherited his father's absolute power, and his father's iron belief that none of it could ever be surrendered. He possessed the doctrine completely, and the ability to wield it not at all. We will return to what that doctrine finally cost. A gentle man handed an inheritance built for a giant, and forbidden by everything he believed to ever lay any of it down. And yet, for a time, the gilded surface held, and it was magnificent beyond anything the modern world had seen. Nicholas II married for love, which was itself rare among monarchs. His bride was Princess Alix of Hesse, a granddaughter of Britain's Queen Victoria, who took the Russian name Alexandra. Theirs was, by every surviving letter, a genuine and passionate devotion, a marriage of real affection at the very top of the world, and the world they sat atop is almost impossible to overstate. The Russian Empire stretched across 1/6 of all the land on earth. The Romanovs were among the richest families in human history. Palaces beyond counting. The legendary Fabergé eggs commissioned at Easter. A court of such opulence that visiting European royals, themselves rich beyond imagining, came away dazzled. The Tsar's personal wealth, measured in today's terms, ran into the billions. Into this splendor came the children. First, in succession, 4 daughters: Olga in 1895, Tatiana in 1897, Maria in 1899, Anastasia in 1901. Here is the first quiet crack beneath the gold. 4 daughters. And in the Romanov system, a daughter could not inherit the throne. Russian law demanded a male heir. So each beautiful, healthy girl was, in the cold arithmetic of the dynasty, another disappointment to a court desperate for a son. The most loved children in the empire were, dynastically, not enough, simply by being girls. But the daughters themselves grew into something remarkable. The four sisters were extraordinarily close. So close they merged their identities into that single signature, Otma, the initials of their names in birth order. Olga, the eldest, was bookish, sensitive and sharp-tongued. Tatiana was elegant, organized, the natural leader the others called the governess. Maria was gentle, warm, dreamy, beautiful. And Anastasia, the youngest, was the family's irrepressible clown, mischievous, witty, impossible to control. And despite the oceans of wealth, their mother raised them with a deliberate, almost severe simplicity. The grand duchesses slept on hard camp beds, took cold baths, wore hand-me-down dresses passed from sister to sister, and did needlework for charity. The richest girls in the world were raised, by their mother's design, to be modest, dutiful, and devout. It is one of the great ironies of the whole story. These were not the spoiled, decadent princesses the revolution would later need them to be. They were sheltered, kind, and good, which would make what was done to them all the more monstrous. The dynasty had everything. And then, in 1904, it finally got the one thing it had prayed for: a son, stand inside the dynasty at its absolute summit, in the year 1913. It was the Romanov tercentenary, 300 years since the first Romanov took the throne in 1613. For weeks, the empire celebrated. Cathedrals blazed with candlelight and incense. Crowds knelt as the imperial family passed. Bells rang across 11 time zones. Nicholas and Alexandra, the four radiant grand duchesses, and the long-awaited little heir, Alexei, stood before their people as the living embodiment of 3 centuries of unbroken divine rule. Picture the image at its peak. The four sisters in matching white gowns and pearls, luminous and serene. The small boy in a sailor suit who would one day rule it all. The handsome Tsar and his beautiful empress, beloved, blessed, eternal. To the millions watching, the house of Romanov was as permanent as the mountains. It had outlasted Napoleon. It had ruled longer than almost any living dynasty on earth. And this is the cruelest fact of the entire story, so hold it close. At that very moment of maximum glory, 300 years of power, oceans of wealth, 5 beautiful children. The dynasty was already dying from the inside. Within 5 years, every single person in that radiant family portrait would be dead, shot or bayoneted in a cellar. The empire had only 4 years left to live. The Romanovs were never more glorious than in 1913. And 1913 was the beginning of the end, because the long-prayed-for son carried a secret that would unravel everything. Alexei, born in 1904, was the most important child in the empire, the male heir 3 generations had waited for, and he was born with hemophilia, an incurable disease of the blood in which the slightest injury, a bruise, a fall, a nosebleed, could become an unstoppable, agonizing internal bleed. A scraped knee could nearly kill him. The future ruler of 1/6 of the earth could be destroyed by a bump against a table. And here the founder doctrine turns lethal. Autocracy demanded a strong male heir to inherit absolute power intact. The dynasty had finally produced one, and he was desperately, secretly fragile. So the family did the thing that doomed them. They hid it. The boy's illness became a state secret, concealed from the public and most of the court. And a mother's terror for her dying son would soon open the palace doors to the one man who seemed able to save him. A secret illness. A desperate mother. A doctrine that could not bend. The door was open, and through it walked Rasputin. The man who walked through that door was a wandering Siberian peasant and self-styled holy man named Grigory Rasputin. And he appeared to do the impossible. Again and again, when the doctors gave up and the heir lay bleeding and screaming, Rasputin would arrive, pray over the boy, and the bleeding would stop. To Empress Alexandra, it was a miracle from God. To the watching court, the watching aristocracy, and soon the watching nation, it was something else entirely. A filthy, scandalous peasant with an unbreakable hold over the imperial family. The crack had opened, and all of Russia was about to fall into it. For a few years the surface of the empire still gleamed, and the family folded in on itself in a way that felt, to them, like safety. Because of Alexei's illness and Alexandra's growing reclusiveness, the imperial family withdrew from the glittering social life of the court. They retreated into the Alexander Palace, into each other, into a tight, loving, almost hermetically sealed domestic world. The parents adored the children. The four sisters were inseparable. The little heir was cherished and watched every waking moment. By every private account, they were a genuinely happy, deeply devoted family. And this is exactly where the story lulls you. The loving home. The devoted parents. The good, modest, kind-hearted girls. You look at this warm family and you think, surely the world would never harm them. Surely goodness is its own protection. It is not. And the very thing that made them feel safe, their withdrawal, their isolation, their retreat into one another, was quietly cutting them off from the empire they were supposed to rule. While the family huddled in their private paradise, Russia outside the palace walls was seething, crushing poverty, a vast, angry peasantry, a growing industrial working class with no rights and no bread. Revolutionary movements spreading like fire. And at the center of it all, a Tsar who, faithful to his father's doctrine, refused to share any meaningful power, refused reform, refused to let the autocracy bend even as the pressure built toward an explosion. The family thought they were safe inside their loving little world. In truth, they had locked themselves in the most dangerous house in Europe and stopped looking out the windows. And then came the day the people stopped believing the Tsar loved them. It began on a Sunday in January 1905, and it shattered the oldest bond in Russia, the sacred trust between the Tsar and his people. For centuries, the Russian peasant had revered the Tsar as the Little Father, a figure almost as holy as God, the protector who would surely help them if only he knew their suffering. So on January 22nd, 1905, a vast, peaceful crowd of workers, men, women and children, carrying religious icons and portraits of the Tsar himself, singing hymns, marched to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg to beg their little father for bread and basic rights. They were not a mob. They came as supplicants, on their knees in spirit, holding up images of the very man they had come to petition. They believed, with total faith, that he would receive them. The imperial troops opened fire on the crowd. Hundreds were killed or wounded, peaceful, unarmed petitioners, cut down in the snow before the palace. The day entered history as Bloody Sunday, and though Nicholas was not even at the palace and did not personally give the order, it did not matter. He was the autocrat. The soldiers were his. The blood was his. In a single morning, the spell of 300 years broke. The little father had fired on his own children. The sacred, almost mystical bond between Tsar and people, the true foundation the entire autocracy rested upon, far more than any army, was severed, and it would never heal. From that day, a new name began to circulate for Nicholas among his people, not Little Father, but Nicholas the Bloody. The 1905 revolution that followed forced Nicholas, briefly, to do the unthinkable, to grant a parliament, the Duma, and a constitution. For a moment, it looked like the autocracy might finally bend and survive. But here, the founder doctrine reasserted its grip. Nicholas, faithful to his father's iron creed that power must never be surrendered, spent the following years systematically clawing back what he had granted, dissolving parliaments, restricting the vote, undermining the reforms. He treated the constitution not as a new foundation, but as a humiliation to be reversed. He had been handed the one chance to transform the dynasty into something that could survive the modern world, and his father's voice in his head would not let him take it. This was the first true crack, not in the family, but in the throne itself. The bond with the people, broken, the chance to reform refused, and waiting in the wings, the scandal that would finish the dynasty's reputation entirely. A peasant mystic, whose shadow now stretched across the imperial bedchamber. The first true casualty of the Romanov collapse was not a person, it was the family's name. And the woman who destroyed it was trying, desperately, only to save her son. Empress Alexandra has come down through history as a villain, and that is unjust. But it is also how the dynasty fell. To understand it, you must hold two truths at once. She was a devoted mother in unbearable agony, watching her only son suffer a disease that could kill him at any moment. And she was, in her terror, making catastrophic decisions that would help doom them all. Picture her position, a German-born princess in a Russia that increasingly distrusted Germans. Shy and stiff in public, which the court read as cold arrogance. A mother hiding a desperate secret, the heir's illness, that she could tell almost no one, and the only relief she had ever found for her dying child came from one man, the coarse, magnetic, scandalous peasant Rasputin. So she clung to him, she trusted him completely. And as the First World War, engulfed Russia, and Nicholas left for the front to command the army. Alexandra, now effectively running the government at home, increasingly leaned on Rasputin's advice in matters of state, appointing and dismissing ministers on the word of a man the entire nation despised. See the doctrine claim its first great victim, because the dynasty hid Alexei's illness, because autocracy could not admit the heir was fragile. The public never understood why the empress clung to this disreputable man. So they invented their own explanations, each one filthier than the last. Rumors of a sexual affair. Whispers that the German-born empress and her mystic were traitors plotting with the enemy. The family's good name, the thing the modest, charitable Grand Duchesses embodied so perfectly, was dragged through the gutter of an entire nation's imagination. And it was all, in the deepest sense, the founder doctrine's doing. A system too rigid to admit weakness, a son's illness too shameful to reveal, a mother's love curdled by secrecy into scandal. What is the use of preserving absolute power for your heir, if preserving it requires hiding what the heir actually is, and that hiding is the very thing that destroys you? Not yet a death, but the first irreversible tragedy. The moment the House of Romanov lost the one thing more important than its army or its wealth, its legitimacy in the eyes of its own people. By the time Rasputin was finally murdered by aristocrats in December 1916, it was far too late. The damage was total. The dynasty was no longer revered. It was hated. And a hated autocrat, in the middle of a catastrophic war, sitting on 300 years of absolute power he refused to share, was about to discover how quickly 3 centuries can end. By early 1917, Russia was breaking apart, and inside the imperial bubble, almost no one would say it aloud. The war had been a catastrophe. Millions of Russian soldiers were dead. The cities were starving. Bread had run out. The railways had failed. And still the messages reaching the Tsar were managed, softened, filtered. A court so terrified of his father's doctrine of unquestioned authority that few dared tell the autocrat the unvarnished truth. The public facade insisted all was well. The divinely appointed Tsar, the loyal people, the empire eternal. The reality was a capital city sliding into open revolt. Soldiers refusing to fire on bread-roting crowds, and a monarchy with almost no one left willing to defend it. And within the family's inner circle, the loyal servants and tutors who lived alongside the Grand Duchesses saw what the public could not. That these were not the scheming royals of rumour, but frightened, decent young women, nursing wounded soldiers as Red Cross volunteers, writing in their diaries, praying, utterly unaware of how completely the ground had given way beneath them. Remember that, while a nation imagined a corrupt, treasonous, decadent imperial family, the actual daughters were rolling bandages in hospital wards. The gap between the Romanovs as symbol and the Romanovs as people had become a chasm, and a nation does not execute people. It executes symbols. In March 1917, the unthinkable happened. The capital was in revolution. The army abandoned him, and Nicholas's own generals and ministers, the men sworn to defend the throne, told him there was only one way to save Russia. He had to abdicate. 300 years of Romanov rule, and it would end, not on a battlefield but with a pen, in a railway carriage, surrounded by men he had trusted, every one of whom had turned against him. On March 15, 1917, in the saloon car of the imperial train, halted at a railway siding, Nicholas II signed away 300 years of Romanov rule. He did it almost gently, a quiet man who had never wanted the throne, laying it down at last. But notice how the founder doctrine seized him, even in the act of surrender. Nicholas first agreed to abdicate in favor of his son Alexei, and then, learning from the doctors that the boy's haemophilia meant he would likely not live long and could never be separated from his parents, he changed the document. He abdicated for himself and for his son, passing the crown to his brother Grand Duke Michael. Sit with that decision, because it is the doctrine's final, fatal expression. A father, even at the end of everything, could not bear to send his fragile son into the storm alone, so he disinherited the boy to keep the family together. A human choice, a loving one. And it meant that for the first time in 3 centuries, there was no clear Romanov successor in waiting. Michael refused the poisoned crown the next day. The monarchy simply stopped. The thing Alexander III had built his son to preserve at all costs evaporated in 48 hours. And here came the betrayal that defines this entire act. Picture Nicholas in that railway carriage. The men urging him to abdicate were not revolutionaries storming the train. They were his own, his generals, his ministers, the aristocrats and commanders who had sworn their lives to the throne. Every one of them had concluded that the Tsar himself was now the obstacle to saving Russia. The autocrat who had refused to share an inch of power with anyone discovered, at the decisive moment, that he had no one left standing beside him. The man who trusted only the doctrine was betrayed by everyone the doctrine was supposed to bind to him. This is the iron law these stories keep teaching. A ruler or a father who hoards all power and shares none builds no true loyalty, only obedience. And obedience evaporates the moment it is tested. Nicholas had subjects, servants, and soldiers by the million. He did not have a single ally willing to fall with him. When the storm came, the most powerful man in Europe stood entirely alone. At first, the abdication seemed survivable. The new provisional government placed the family under house arrest in their beloved Alexander Palace. There were even quiet plans to send them into comfortable exile abroad. To Britain, where Nicholas's first cousin sat on the throne and looked almost identical to him. And then that door too closed. The British government, fearing the deeply unpopular Russian royals would inflame revolutionary feeling at home, quietly withdrew the offer of asylum. King George V abandoned his own cousin. One by one, every escape route sealed. The relatives who could have saved them looked away, exactly as Nicholas's generals had. The most connected family on earth, related to half the crowned heads of Europe, found that royal blood bought them nothing at all when the danger was real. The family that had ruled 1/6 of the world was now a liability no one wanted to touch. And events were accelerating beyond anyone's control. In the autumn of 1917, a second revolution swept away the moderate provisional government. The Bolsheviks, hard, disciplined, merciless, seized power under Lenin. And to the Bolsheviks, the captive imperial family was not a tragedy to be managed. It was a problem to be solved. The Romanovs, they understood, were a living flag. As long as the Tsar and his son drew breath, every anti-revolutionary army in the gathering civil war had a rightful monarch to rally around. The family was no longer a symbol of the past. They were a threat to the future, and the new regime did not leave threats alive. The order came to move the family east, deep into the Ural Mountains, to a mid-sized industrial city named Yekaterinburg, a Bolshevik stronghold far from any rescue. The place chosen for them was a confiscated merchant's mansion in Yekaterinburg, requisitioned from its owner, an engineer named Ipatiev. The Bolsheviks gave it a chillingly bureaucratic name. They called it the House of Special Purpose. The special purpose was never stated aloud, but the house made it clear. The windows were whitewashed over and sealed shut, so the family could not see out and no one could see in. A high double palisade of timber was built around the building, blocking it from the street. Machine guns were positioned at the corners. The Grand Duchesses, who had grown up in palaces of light and air, now lived in a sealed box, watched day and night by armed guards who often loathed them. And here, in captivity, the true character of the four sisters showed itself, the thing that makes their fate unbearable rather than merely sad. They did not rage, they adapted. Olga, the eldest, grew quiet and prayerful, carrying the weight of it most heavily. Tatiana organized their meager daily life with the same calm competence she always had. Maria, warm and open, actually befriended some of the young guards, chatting with them about their families. Until commanders, alarmed that the prisoners were becoming human to their captors, replaced those guards with harder men. And Anastasia, 17 now, still made the others laugh, still performed small defiances, still refused to let the darkness win entirely. Understand who these young women were in that house, not scheming royals. 4 sisters and a sick little brother doing needlework, reading aloud to their ailing mother, caring for Alexei through his bleeding episodes, holding tightly to each other and to their faith. They were brave in the small, daily, human way that does not make headlines. The bravery of people trying to stay decent inside a tightening cage. And as they did, they kept a secret of their own, a precaution their mother had ordered, an act of hope disguised as a chore. Sewn carefully into the seams and linings of their clothing, hidden against their bodies beneath their plain dresses, was the last of the family fortune they had managed into captivity. A king's ransom in diamonds and jewels, stitched into the corsets of 4 young women. They believed it might one day buy their freedom. It would do the opposite. By July 1918, the civil war was closing in on Yekaterinburg. An anti-Bolshevik army, The Whites, joined by the Czechoslovak Legion, was advancing on the city, and they were winning. Within weeks, perhaps days, they would take Yekaterinburg, and the Bolsheviks holding the imperial family understood exactly what that meant. If the Whites reached the House of Special Purpose, they would free the Tsar. And a freed Tsar was a living banner, around which the entire counter-revolution could unite. This is the moment the family's value inverted with lethal speed. For 300 years, the Romanovs had been precious because they were the rightful rulers of Russia. Now that same fact, their legitimacy, the thing the founder doctrine had fought to preserve absolutely, became the precise reason they had to die. The inheritance Alexander III bled to protect did not save his descendants, it marked them. They were too dangerous to be allowed to live, specifically because of who they had been born to be. The decision was made. Historians still debate whether the direct order came from the local Ural Soviet from Moscow, or both, but the responsibility ultimately ran to the very top of the Bolshevik regime. The local commander of the house, a man named Yakov Yurovsky, was put in charge of carrying it out. Yurovsky planned it with cold, bureaucratic care. We know the details largely from his own later depositions, the executioner's own account. The killing would happen in the cellar, a small room he selected because it was below ground, and its walls would contain the noise. The family would be told they were being moved again for their safety, photographed to prove they were alive, asked to dress and come downstairs quietly in the middle of the night. They would suspect nothing until the last possible moment. So who betrayed the Romanov daughters? The easy answer is the Bolsheviks or Yurovsky or Lenin's regime, and they pulled the triggers. But look at the longer chain of betrayal that delivered 4 innocent girls into that cellar. Betrayed by a grandfather's doctrine that built an empire too rigid to reform. Betrayed by a father who clung to that doctrine until revolution was the only release. Betrayed by generals who abandoned the throne, by royal cousins who withdrew their asylum, by a court that lied to keep the autocrat comfortable. Every one of them, in turn, looked at the Romanovs and chose something else over 4 young women's lives. By the time Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia walked down those cellar stairs, they had been failed by absolutely everyone. Their dynasty, their nation, their relatives, and the entire system of inherited power that had created them and then discarded them. What had these 4 girls actually done? They had rolled bandages. They had nursed their sick brother. They had prayed and sown and loved their family. Their only crime was their bloodline, an inheritance they never chose and could not refuse. This is the betrayal at the dark heart of the story. That an accident of birth, glorious in 1913, had become a death sentence by 1918. The daughters were about to die for a doctrine they had no part in making. It was past midnight. July 17, 1918. A guard woke the family and told them to dress and come downstairs. They were being moved, he said, for their own safety. What follows is drawn from the testimony of the men who were in that room, chiefly Yurovsky's own deposition. It is told plainly, without sensation, because the facts need none. In the small hours of July 17, 1918, the family was woken and told to dress and prepare to move. They did so calmly. They had been moved before. The 4 daughters helped their mother and their ailing brother. And as they dressed, the girls put on, beneath their outer clothes, the special undergarments their mother had prepared. The corsets and bodices into which pounds of the family's diamonds had been sewn. They were led down into the cellar, a bare room perhaps 12 to 15 feet across. Chairs were brought in at the family's request, for the Empress and for Alexei, who could not stand for long. The 4 sisters stood together with their parents and their few remaining loyal servants, the family doctor, the cook, the maid, the valet. 11 people in a small, whitewashed room. Yurovsky told them to wait. A photograph was needed, he said, to prove to Moscow they were alive. Then the squad of executioners filed in, and Yurovsky read out the sentence of death. Nicholas, by the accounts, had time only to turn toward his family and utter a word or two of disbelief before the firing began. The first volley killed the Tsar and the Empress almost at once. But when the gunmen turned their fire on the 4 daughters, standing together against the far wall, the unthinkable happened. The bullets struck them and seemed to bounce away. The girls remained standing in the smoke, terrified, alive. To the superstitious, panicking gunmen, it looked for a moment like divine protection, like the Grand Duchesses could not be killed. It was not divine protection. It was the diamonds. The fortune sewn into their corsets, pounds of hard, dense gemstones packed tight against their bodies, had formed a literal armor, deflecting and stopping the revolver rounds at close range. The inheritance their mother had hidden to buy their freedom now did the cruelest thing imaginable. It kept them alive in that cellar, conscious and unhurt, in the middle of their own execution. Understand what that means, and you understand this entire channel's thesis made flesh. The Romanovs' defining obsession was the preservation of their wealth and their inheritance. And in the final seconds, that very wealth, those hidden diamonds, turned on the daughters. The thing meant to save them prolonged their deaths. It denied them the mercy of a quick end. The fortune did not protect the children. It tortured them. What followed, when the gunman realized the girls were still alive, was the most harrowing part of the entire event, and I will describe it with restraint, because the dignity of these young women demands it. The room had filled with choking smoke, and the wounded were screaming. The squad, horrified and disordered, resorted to bayonets and close-range shots to finish what the first volley could not. It was not quick. It was chaotic, prolonged, and savage. When it was over, all 11 were dead. The Tsar, the Empress, the 4 daughters, the young heir, and the 4 servants who had chosen to stay. And only afterward, as the bodies were undressed for burial, did the killers discover the truth. As they handled the daughters' corpses, jewels spilled from the torn and bullet-struck clothing, diamonds scattering across the cellar floor. The executioners found themselves on their knees, gathering up the hidden fortune of the family they had just destroyed. The secret was revealed at the worst possible moment, to the worst possible people, for the worst possible reason. Olga was 22. Tatiana, 21. Maria, 19. Anastasia, 17. The 4 sisters who signed their letters as one, Otma, died together, against one wall, in a room 12 feet wide, wearing the last of their family's wealth, which had failed them in every way a thing can fail. 300 years of empire, oceans of diamonds and gold, and in the end, what did all of it purchase for 4 innocent girls? A few extra seconds of terror in a cellar. Nothing more. That was the inheritance. At the very beginning, I told you this story started not with the daughters but with a doctrine, Alexander III's iron creed that absolute power must be preserved, completely, and surrendered never. It is time to close that loop, and to weigh what the doctrine finally cost. Here is the terrible logic, traced end to end. The founder believed power must never bend, so he raised a son to hold it absolutely, but ran out of time to teach him how. The son inherited the rigidity without the strength, clung to the doctrine through every warning, and refused every chance to reform. Refused after Bloody Sunday, refused after 1905, refused the parliament, refused to share an inch. A more flexible dynasty, the kind that became a constitutional monarchy, like the cousins in Britain, would have bent and survived, and those 4 girls would have grown old as harmless princesses. The Romanovs would not bend, so they broke. And when an autocracy breaks, it does not break gently, because it has left no softer structure to catch the fall. It shatters all the way to the bottom, to a cellar, to bayonets, to children. That was the darkest secret of the House of Romanov. Not a scandal, not a crime, but a doctrine. A founder so devoted to preserving the inheritance intact that he made the inheritance impossible to survive. He wanted to hand his son an empire that could never be diminished. What he actually handed down was a death sentence that took 24 years to arrive and fell, in the end, not on him, but on 4 granddaughters he never lived to meet. The diamonds in the corset and the doctrine in the bloodline were the same thing. Finally, both were attempts to preserve the family's wealth and power absolutely. Both were meant to protect. And both, in that cellar, did precisely the opposite. They made the dying longer, the betrayal deeper, the tragedy complete. What is the use of preserving an inheritance perfectly, if the preservation is the very thing that kills the people you meant to give it to? The 4 sisters were gone. The 300-year dynasty was gone. And in the cellar's silence, the killers gathered diamonds off the floor and prepared to make 11 bodies disappear. But they would fail at that last task. They would hide the body so badly and lie about them so thoroughly that they accidentally created the most haunting mystery of the 20th century and gave the world 90 years of a desperate, beautiful, false hope. A hope that one of the daughters had walked out of that basement alive. The killing took perhaps 20 minutes. Hiding the evidence would take the executioners 2 desperate nights. And they would still get it wrong. Yurovsky's squad loaded the 11 bodies onto a truck in the dark and drove into the forest outside Yekaterinburg, toward an abandoned mineshaft called the Four Brothers. There, the plan collapsed almost immediately. The truck bogged down in the mud. The mine was too shallow to hide anything. Curious locals had seen them, and as they stripped the bodies, more hidden jewels spilled out. The last of the diamonds the daughters had carried, scattering in the mud by lamplight. Panicked, Yurovsky started over the next night. The bodies were moved again, doused with sulfuric acid to disfigure them beyond recognition, and buried in 2 separate places. The main grave held 9 of the 11, but 2 bodies, later determined to be the young heir, Alexei, and one of his sisters, were buried apart. In a second, smaller grave a short distance away. That single's decision, to separate 2 of the children from the rest, was a clumsy attempt to confuse anyone who might count the bodies and realize the whole family was dead. And it worked far too well. By hiding 2 of the children separately, the killers accidentally ensured that when the main grave was eventually found, 2 Romanov children would be missing from it. A missing daughter, a grave that didn't add up. It was the seed of a myth that would haunt the world for 90 years. The new Soviet regime then did something that turned a massacre into a mystery. It lied. Officially, the Bolsheviks announced only that Nicholas, the bloody Tsar, had been executed. About the wife and children, they were deliberately vague, at times suggesting the family had been moved to a place of safety. For decades, the Soviet state refused to admit the full truth, that they had shot 4 young women, a sick boy, and 4 servants in a cellar, and hidden the bodies in a forest. Into that official silence, hope rushed in. If the government wouldn't confirm the children were dead, then perhaps, somehow, one of them had survived. And the rumors fixed almost at once on the youngest daughter, Anastasia, the mischievous one, the survivor in spirit. The story took hold across the world. In the chaos of the basement, the legend went, the youngest Grand Duchess had been shielded by the bodies of her family, had survived the bullets, and we now know exactly why that detail felt plausible. The diamonds really had stopped the first volley, and had somehow been carried out alive. For 90 years, that hope refused to die. The most famous claimant was a woman who surfaced in Germany in 1920, pulled from a canal, who eventually claimed to be Anastasia. The world came to know her as Anna Anderson. For decades, she fought to be recognized as the surviving Grand Duchess. Some surviving Romanov relatives and acquaintances believed her. Most did not. Court cases dragged on for years. Books were written. A Hollywood film was made. The legend of the lost princess became one of the most romantic mysteries of the 20th century. And you can understand why the world clung to it so fiercely. The truth, 4 innocent sisters butchered in a cellar, was unbearable. The legend offered an escape, that goodness had survived, that the youngest and brightest had slipped away, that the story had one thread of mercy in it. The world did not want Anastasia to be alive because of the diamonds. It wanted her alive because it could not stand for her to be dead. But hope is not evidence, and the ground outside Yekaterinburg still held the truth. The forest gave up its secret slowly. In 1979, amateur investigators secretly located the main grave, but in the Soviet Union, the discovery could not be revealed. Only after the USA began to crumble was the larger grave officially exhumed in 1991. Inside were 9 sets of remains. DNA testing, using among others a sample from Prince Philip, a direct maternal relative of the Empress, confirmed it. Nicholas, Alexandra, 3 of their daughters, and 4 servants. But only 3 daughters, Alexei and 1 sister, were still missing. The grave still didn't add up, and for a few more years the door to the legend stayed open a crack. Then, in 2007, near the main site, investigators found the second, smaller grave. The burned remains the killers had separated and hidden. DNA testing confirmed the final, unbearable truth. The remains were those of Tsarevich Alexei and the missing Grand Duchess. The family was complete. All 7 Romanovs, and all 4 servants, had died in that house. No one walked out of the basement. No one survived. And Anna Anderson? DNA testing on her preserved tissue, after her death, had already delivered the verdict by the 1990s. She was not Anastasia. She was not a Romanov at all. The most famous survivor in history was a fiction. A poignant one, but a fiction. So this is the answer to the question we began with. What really happened in that basement? Everything. It all happened to all of them. The science is now certain. There was no miraculous escape, no lost princess, no mercy hidden in the dark. The 90-year hope that one daughter survived was the world's way of refusing the truth. The truth is that the inheritance killed them all, everyone. Lay the whole dynasty out, end to end, and look at what one man's doctrine finally produced. Alexander III, the founder figure, died in 1894, a giant who built an empire of absolute power and drilled into his unready son a single command: never surrender any of it. Nicholas II inherited that doctrine and obeyed it to the end. Refused reform after his soldiers fired on praying crowds, refused to share power after revolution, clawed back every concession, and ruled himself, his throne, and his family straight into the abyss. Alexandra, a mother in terror for a dying son, clung to a peasant mystic and destroyed the dynasty's name trying to save her boy. Alexei, the long-awaited heir, the most important child in the empire, bled through a short, frightened life and was burned in a forest grave at 13. And the 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, guilty of nothing but their birth, nursed wounded soldiers, prayed, kept each other brave through captivity, and were shot and bayoneted in a cellar before any of them reached 23, wearing the diamonds that prolonged their dying. One cause sits beneath all of it, not the Bolsheviks alone, not the war alone. The deepest cause was a doctrine, the conviction that an inheritance of absolute power must be preserved completely and never allowed to bend. That single belief, passed from a father to a son who could not carry it, made every disaster inevitable. The rigidity, the refusal to reform, the revolution, the cellar. A dynasty that could have bent and lived, chose on principle to stay rigid and die. How do 300 years and 1/6 of the earth end in a basement 12 feet wide? The same way every one of these families ends, when the people at the top love the inheritance more than they understand the world it has to survive in. The Romanovs had the greatest inheritance of power and wealth in modern history. It bought them a sealed house, a forest grave, and 4 murdered daughters. The fortune in the corset and the doctrine in the blood did the same thing in the end. Neither one protected a single child. Be careful with the lesson, because it would be easy to take the wrong one. The lesson is not that the Romanovs deserved it. They did not. 4 innocent girls and a sick child can never deserve a cellar. And it is not that power or wealth are simply evil. The villain was never the inheritance itself. The villain was the rigidity. The belief that what you inherit must be clutched, undiminished and unchanged, no matter what the world outside demands. The British cousins, who looked almost identical to Nicholas, faced the same century of upheaval, but their monarchy bent. It gave up real power, became a constitutional symbol, made itself survivable. They are still here. The Romanovs, who would not give up an inch, are bones identified by DNA. That is the whole difference. One family treated its inheritance as a living thing that had to adapt to survive. The other treated it as a sacred object that could never be altered. And the sacred object became a tomb. And here the dead Romanovs stop being history and become a mirror. Because the temptation Alexander III surrendered to is a human one, not just an imperial one. The belief that what we built, what we were given, what we hand down, must be preserved exactly as it is, that bending it is betraying it. The Romanovs are the proof of where that ends. They loved the inheritance so completely that they could not save the children who were supposed to receive it. 4 sisters paid for that doctrine with their lives. They never chose the throne. They never wanted the diamonds. They wanted, by every surviving letter, only their family, their faith, and each other. And in the end, that was the one inheritance no one could take from them, and the only one that ever mattered. There is a giant, somewhere at the start of this story, an iron Tsar who could bend a poker with his hands, and who believed, to his bones, that the power he held must be passed down whole, undiminished, surrendered never. He got his wish. He handed his son an empire that could not bend. And because it could not bend, it broke all the way down, past the throne, past the war, past the revolution, to a room 12 feet wide, where 4 of his granddaughters stood against a wall wearing the last of the family's diamonds. The jewels were sewn in to preserve the fortune. The doctrine was drilled in to preserve the power. Both were meant to protect the family. And in that cellar, both did the same final thing. They made the ending crueler, and protected no one at all. For 90 years the world hoped one daughter had escaped. The truth is that none did. But they did leave something behind that no firing squad could reach. 4 sisters who signed as one, who stayed kind in a sealed house, who faced the dark together. Otma, That is what really survived the basement.